I don't know what it is about the i5-12400F, but I can't help but think of it as boring. Maybe it's the locked multiplier, or the low boost frequency, or the lack of fancy E-cores. Maybe it's because it's just one digit away from the most milquetoast Dell Optiplex-ass CPU I've ever used, but I've changed my tune today. Not that the i5-12400F is suddenly not boring, just that sometimes boring is good, actually. Over the course of its 15-year lifespan, the definition of an Intel i5 changed radically. The earliest generation had as few as 2 hyper-threaded cores, and while 6 cores became the standard as far back as the 8th gen, it all got a bit messy towards the end. The 12th gen Alder Lake series has the distinction of being a crossover generation, featuring what might prove to be the last 6-core 12-thread chips Intel ever make. The drive towards energy efficiency, bringing hybrid big little core architectures to the mid and high end, has ultimately made it harder to know exactly what you're getting from an Intel. The i5-12400F at least deserves some points for clarity. The 6-core 12-thread CPU, lacking integrated graphics as designated by the F at the end, currently sells for about £115 here in the UK, and given that some games have started listing 6 cores as a recommended system requirement, that makes this one of the most relevant budget desktop CPUs on the market right now. Based on the still current LGA 1700 socket, at least at the time of recording, the i5-12400F features clock speeds up to 4.4 GHz, 10nm lithography, and a locked multiplier. You might be thinking that this doesn't seem to offer much that you couldn't get from an 8th gen i7 or 11th gen i5 if you're concerned about PCI Express 4. But there's more to it than just threads and clocks. In addition to the architectural improvements that came with Alder Lake, the big appeal in the 12400F is its 18 MB of level 3 cache. And for gamers, that makes all the difference in the world. To test the 12400F, I have it installed on an MSI Z690 Mag Torpedo motherboard, cooled with what's probably an overkill Thermalright dual tower cooler, and paired up with 32GB of DDR5 RAM. Although the rated compatible speed only goes up to 4800 MT, I'm using the Corsair Vengeance kit at its XMP speed of 6000 with a cache latency of 30. The GPU is my usual Radeon RX 6900 XT, though as with some other newer model CPUs I've tested lately, it's getting close to becoming a bottleneck. More on that later. It won't shock anyone to learn that Valorant absolutely screams on the 12400F. In fact, it screams on pretty much any modern CPU, but if you want to play on a 180 or 240Hz display, you need some serious performance, and the GPU alone won't cover it. Despite being a fairly humble chip, the 12400F can clock in at over 370 FPS on average, a healthy 10% above the old overclocked flagship Intels, though still a way short of the lofty heights of Zen 3 and 4. This actually had me interested to see how the 12600K does with some higher clock speeds, as I don't doubt that with some extra juice, Alder Lake could be right up there with the Ryzen 5000 chips. Once again, in Fortnite, we're up in the rarefied air of the high refresh territory, with an average frame rate that's enough to saturate even some pretty fancy monitors. Using performance mode, it's possible to obtain about 330 FPS, with 1% lows over 180. Regarding the comparison chart, I don't know how many of these results are still relevant, as some of them were captured a few months ago, and the feeling I'm getting is that Fortnite performance has taken a bit of a hit lately. Onto Counter-Strike 2, and again, no surprises. With an average FPS of 260 and 1% lows over 120, The 12400F is right up there with the old i7s and i9s, and only about 15% short of the higher clocked Ryzen 5 5600X. Compared to the latest generation Ryzen equivalent, however, the Alder Lake chip does fall about 100 frames short. I don't know what happened to Warzone lately, but it seems to be the anti-Fortnite. The last few CPUs I've tested have all run like a dream, and as a result, the i5 12400F is right up at the top of the chart with the Ryzen 7500F, a chip that was running about 1 GHz higher clocked. I'm not complaining, of course, but if the game has had some kind of radical boost in performance, I may have to go back and retest some CPUs. I was already aware from watching other people's content that Starfield is best optimised for Intel, particularly their more recent chips. It's no surprise then that the i5 does extremely well here, averaging 85 FPS even in the hellscape that is New Atlantis. I should point out the i3 12100F here. In its own standalone review I tested it with 4800 speed RAM, but for this video I retested the i3 in single player titles with the RAM at its XMP speed, and it gained about an extra 10%. And another monster result for the 12400F, Cyberpunk 2077 clearly loves Alder Lake, and honestly, I think if I'm going to test any other chips on this socket, I'm going to need a faster GPU. At 1080 medium we're up above 130 FPS, within spitting distance of the overclocked 7500F, and a noticeable margin above the 5600X. Again, the 12100F also got a nice, near 15% boost from the RAM overclock. With ray tracing ultra enabled and performance upscaling, the i5 still keeps above 70 FPS on average, giving it a healthy lead over the 5600X. The Last of Us is another game that's verging on GPU limited here. With the game at 1080 high, the 6900 XT is getting dangerously close to 100% utilization at times, with the average FPS of 108, only 10 frames behind the 7500F. I have tested some of the faster chips at 1080 medium with FSR quality in order to give a little more headroom, and that shows that the i5 isn't quite as close to the latest Ryzens as the previous tests suggested. The 12400F gains just 5 frames at these settings, whereas the 7500F gained a whopping 30 frames in the same test. I believe that since the i3 12100F review a few weeks ago, there's been a performance patch for Dragon's Dogma 2, so I actually went back and retested it before I installed the i5. With the stock RAM profile, there's been a marked improvement in performance. Which isn't saying much, as last time it was an absolute clusterfuck. Now it's about 10% above the cheapo Ryzen 5 4500, which makes a lot more sense, and enabling XMP sees averages soar to above 60 FPS. Though 1% and 0.1% lows are still appalling. Anyway, back onto the main event, the i5 12400F can reach 70 FPS with DDR5 6000, more than 10% above the i3. Though, of course, it's going to take more than a CPU upgrade to make this thing playable. Capcom, you still have a way to go. Like Dragon's Dogma 2, Jedi Survivor isn't featured on this video for being particularly playable. The biggest issues with this game aren't in the areas I benchmark in, it's usually the cutscenes, with large amounts of particles and alpha effects that cause frame times to fall apart. Still, for what it's worth, this is a very healthy average FPS. It's really the 1% and 0.1% that give away the fact that the game will stutter a lot over time. Once again, the i3 12100F gained a pretty big boost from the higher RAM frequencies. Finally, and unsurprisingly, Civ 6's turn time benchmark is no challenge for the i5. The best result I saw was 6.12 seconds, a hair ahead of the Ryzen 5 5600X. When it comes to productivity, the 12400F is perhaps a little lacking compared to even older 8 cores, but it's still good enough for someone who uses their PC for the occasional creative task. Rendering out a video in Davinci Resolve is something usually best left to the GPU, but if for some reason you want to leave it to the CPU, then the i5 is about on par with the Ryzen 5 4500 and a fair amount behind the 5600X. Meanwhile, in the Blender Classroom test, the i5 actually fares a little better than the Zen 3 chip, completing the render about 20 seconds sooner, though the 8-core Ryzen 7 5700X is about a minute 40 faster than that. I have to admit, I let the i5 12400F's boring facade convince me that it wasn't as good a buy as other chips. The lack of E-cores next to the 12600K and later generation locked i5s, the lack of overclocking, at least without a motherboard with an external clock generator, even the lack of integrated graphics for QuickSync always meant I was a little more inclined to recommend the Ryzen alternatives. This has changed my tune, a little. I still think there's a lot to recommend about AM4, and AM5 is the path to take if you're looking for something to last a few more upgrade cycles. But if you're not interested in overclocking or tweaking precision boost overdrive settings, and just want a good, reliable, high-performance chip for gaming, I don't think I have a better suggestion at this price point right now. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.